Well, good morning, everyone. I'll start actually by giving the answer to the last question I was asked when I was in India in May. And I was asked by someone what I thought the prospects were for India in comparison to China over the next 5 years. And I thought this could be a politically charged question. So the answer I gave was that I did not think that China would beat India at cricket any time in the next 5 years. Um, so I got away with that, fortunately. Um, it must have been much nicer, by the way, looking at Julie Rome from SAP than looking at me at this time of the morning. So I'll do my best. So one of the exciting things about 2014, because I look ahead a little, is that in March 2014, as some of you will know, Tim Berners-Lee, a scientist, a physicist at CERN in Switzerland, wrote a paper, a proposal, which I can't quote from it exactly, in which he proposed the idea of connecting the hypertext transfer protocol with the domain name system protocol. And the paper he wrote ended with the words "ta-da," and that ta-da became the World Wide Web. So in March of 2014, the World Wide Web is 25 years old. And my goodness, how things have changed since then. And I think what we've seen just generally in the world is two things. The first is that Tim Berners-Lee intended the World Wide Web as a interactive communications medium. That was how he saw it originally. Yet, interestingly, when marketers and publishers began to adopt the World Wide Web in the middle of the 1990s, they actually adopted it principally as a one-way publishing medium rather than as a two-way communication medium. At the same time, though, the consumer, just to prove the consumer is always ahead of the marketer and the advertiser, embraced it most from their point of view as a communication medium. In the same way that they embraced SMS in the 1980s, they embraced instant messenger in the 1990s and into the 2000s. And clearly now we're in the second decade of the 21st century. The communication platforms of Facebook, of Twitter, of Weibo and Renren and Mixi and others around the world still dominate what the consumers think about the internet. So there's one group of people, which is us folks, the advertisers and the publisher folks, who think of it as a publishing platform, but the consumer predominantly thinks about it as a communication platform. And I think when we look at the commercial history of the web, I once gave a presentation that just had 4 lines on it and I did this presentation, I think, in 1999, that said, this is the way the internet will look to consumers. And the first slide on the presentation said http://www.amazon.com. The second slide said www.amazon.com. The third slide said amazon.com, and the fourth slide said Amazon. And the point I was making is that as new people come to what we thought of then as technology, the technology and the wiring, if you like, the hypertext transfer protocol and so forth, just became increasingly invisible over time. And I think what's happened with the emergence of Facebook and Twitter, and especially the app ecosystem, which of course is so important in a market like India, where many people's experience of the internet is based around a mobile device, is that the wiring that sits underneath the internet has begun to disappear in the eyes of the consumer, and you don't go through those same processes. So when you type a search in Chrome now, you don't go to a search box, you just get to the URL bar and the suggestions start to flow. And so what's happening is the wiring of the internet has become invisible, and the functionality of the internet has become infinitely smarter. And we've seen a huge change in the way people use the internet over the last 25 years. Clearly, the first huge change was no internet to dial-up. The next big change was dial-up to broadband, which was in many ways a bigger change than from something to nothing. The change now is the change to the mobile device. And it's interesting when we think about Facebook and their 1.2 billion users around the world and their incredible 750 million daily users around the world, that 550 million of those daily users around the world are now mobile users. And Facebook, along with Qualcomm and Samsung and others, including Nokia and therefore by extension Microsoft, are launching, in the process of launching, internet.org, which is a kind of not-for-profit, if you like, which is designed to take the internet from the 2 billion connected people we have in the world today to 4 and 5 billion connected people by the time we get to 2020. And so it's pretty apparent that by the time we get to 2020, if we follow the decline of the PC market in one direction, the rise of the mobile market in terms of handsets and tablets in the other direction, that when we have 5 billion internet users on the planet, 80% of the total internet usage will be on a mobile device of some description or another. And what we'll see is lots of the highest utility activities, whether they're apps or e-commerce or communication, being a handheld experience, and many of the kind of richer publishing experiences, whether it's video or interactive magazines or whatever, being really led by the tablet market. And now we're moving into a world where you have $160 smartphones in India and $199 tablets available around the world. I think we can see that as one direction. Now, one of the fascinating things about this for me is what it means for advertisers and in terms of the interfaces you create, because when I look at the faces on the screen that I can see at the bottom, and I know there's many of you can't see, my guess is that most of you guys grew up with keyboards and you grew up with a mouse to operate those keyboards, but the new generation of consumers will never use keyboards in quite that way, and they will be a touch interface generation. And what we choose to do in terms of the information design that we create for those experiences, whether it's branding, communications, or e-commerce, is going to be dominated over time by voice activation, touch activation, and gesture activation. And so the whole science of information design, which we'd only just gotten used to for the web, now we have to dump again and start over. And for those of you that built an e-commerce store for a keyboard and a mouse, this is not the equivalent of changing a little bit of the furniture in the store. This is kind of knocking down the store and building a new one and hoping some of the infrastructure at the back end can be reused. And there are many people who, I think, as internet marketers, whether they're agencies or manufacturing businesses, haven't really realized just how quickly you have to iterate design and development in both the destinations you want people to go to, the presences you build on other people's platforms, the assets you have to create to respond to the different kind of environments that people use. And this is going to be hard work. It's going to be more channels, more assets, more segments of consumer behavior, and there's a lot of stress going to be placed on the system inside marketing, and there already is, but inside marketing over the next few years. So I think that's really significant. One of the things that we've kind of been looking at a lot is saying, you know, reach is still important to advertisers. Advertisers still like massive audiences, and if you're Lever or Procter or Colgate, Palmolive or Nestle, then your business works because you sell things in millions, tens of millions, and even billions of units. You're not a one-to-one marketer in a classic sense. And so in your business, things like reach and recency and frequency remain extremely important, and as important as they ever have done in marketing. And in India, at least, which is becoming not the case in some markets around the world, that you still have very, very, very substantial reach from a number of segments in TV, obviously in live sports. And I think you had quite a large TV audience for a certain cricket match that was played in Mumbai a couple of weeks ago. I hear a few people watched that on TV. And one of the things that we are working a lot with our media partners on now is how do we extend the advertiser experience beyond the commercial and the broadcast and into what's become known as second streaming? How do we engage in the simultaneous activities that run concurrent with the program? How do we engage with the social stream that comes from the program? And how do we negotiate with the owner of that program to take some of those content assets and push those content assets into the social streams that we, the advertiser, operate? And I think that, you know, the next phase of that, we'll see quite a lot more of that in the Winter Olympics in Sochi coming up in February. We saw a lot of it around London 2012, and I think Brazil 2014 will be a massive area where people are exploiting high cost but high reach assets and extracting more value out of them through all of the social and other engagement connections they can build across the internet device ecosystem. And that's going to be very important. The other area that we're paying an awful lot of attention to is this concept of marketing and the stream. Now let me describe that for a moment for those of you that haven't read some of the things that I've written about it. But when we think about marketing the stream, we think a lot about Facebook, a lot about Twitter, a lot about LinkedIn, and increasingly many different mobile applications. Because the way we see those things developing is that instead of a page turning environment or a point and click environment that we got used to in much internet media, we are now looking at a situation where people are taking one finger, and I don't know if you can see, I'm demonstrating one finger in front of my face, and they are scrolling up and down that screen, and they are experiencing a feed. Now, when people consume media through a feed, what we have to think about from a creative point of view, an interaction point of view, is what kind of advertising and communication works in the feed so it gets the attention of the user. What is it that can both achieve a kind of light touch awareness and engagement, but also the invitation to interact with a deeper experience? And how do we do that without upsetting and interfering with the user experience? Because the truth of it is, guys, as we know from TV over the years, people didn't really come to those environments for the specific purpose of consuming advertising. People bought copies of Vogue to consume advertising and car magazines to consume advertising, but they don't go to Facebook or Twitter just to consume advertising. And we're seeing more and more developments of newsreaders and various other things, as well as the big social platforms that are these feed-based environments, and this delicate balance of user experience versus advertiser experience and value. And it's also become increasingly obvious to most of us that the whole world of social media and what also many people called earned media, in that paid, owned, and earned organization, has become less organically social than people hoped. So, and I apologize because I'm sure many of you know this story or a variation on it, that when brands first started building brand pages on Facebook and going to buy likes on Facebook, it was their assumption that when they published a new piece of content to their Facebook fan page, that all of the people that had decided to become friends of that brand would see those messages in their newsfeed. And that was the received wisdom. And it was perceived also that when those people interacted with that piece of information in their newsfeed, then it would be shared with all of their friends too. Now, I'm going back to the 29th of February 2012, and Facebook and their executives stood up in the massive hall of the Natural History Museum in New York on Central Park, which right now has got many large balloons outside it that have been inflated for the Macy's Thanksgiving parade that starts in a couple of hours. And they told the advertiser audience that actually, on average, only 16% of a brand's posts actually made it to their fans. And the reason for this is that Facebook has an algorithmic filter of relevance. And Mark Zuckerberg, who you all know of, everyone who's really famous in the internet has to have a law. And Zuckerberg's law is that the amount of content shared by individuals will double per individual every year. Can someone just confirm that you still got audio?
Yep,
yes,
we can hear you.
I have audio.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Sorry, I just lost video on my side for a second. That's good. So if the amount of content that individuals share every year doubles, and the number of individuals sharing content increases too, then clearly you get to a place where it's not possible for all of the people to consume all of the content of all of their social networks. So what Facebook had to do to respond to that was to put an algorithmic filter on that content sharing. And as a consequence of that is that Facebook tries to surface information that's shared that they perceive, or that the algorithm perceives, to be most relevant to the person whose newsfeed they're populating. Which means that, in short, if someone interacts frequently with a friend or with a brand, responds frequently to the posts of a friend or the posts of the brand, then that person will see a lot of content in their newsfeed from that friend or the brand. Now, clearly, when you hear a speech like that, you know that the next sentence is, and the inverse is true. So if you manage to acquire a friend to your Facebook page, but then that friend and you did not interact very often, you will soon become invisible to that friend. And that notion, even of 16% of organic posts being shared for many brands, is now in the low single digits. So from an advertiser and marketer perspective, Facebook, for the most part, has become a reach medium now, and a very big reach medium, rather than an earned media environment. And my latest post on this subject, which is on one blog but will go on LinkedIn on Monday, is called Earned Media ? You get what you pay for. And I think it's very important that advertisers moderate their expectations of how the balance between paid media, owned media, and earned media will change, and realize that despite the hopes we had of social media, that whilst it is very important as a reach medium, the idea that somehow it's a free lunch is an idea that needs to be consigned to history. And I think that's a very important issue. Twitter, on the other hand, which is a very different platform and used for different things, and as you know, there's a kind of an interesting 95-5 rule, which is a variation on the 80-20 rule with Twitter, in which 95% of the tweets that are made on Twitter are made by 5% of the Twitter population, and that there are many, many, many more spectators, if you like, on Twitter than there are participants. The difference is that if you build a follower base on Twitter, and the follower bases on Twitter are pretty much at the moment dominated by technology companies like Google, Apple, Samsung, and others, that if you build a follower base, there is no organic filter. So if someone chooses to follow your brand, your tweet will organically find its way into that person's stream. Now, to be clear, what that means is they have an opportunity to see that tweet, and it rather depends on how quickly they scroll through their feed as to whether or not you will get visibility. And it's obvious also that the more people that an individual chooses to follow, the higher the volume of the tweets in their feed, and therefore the more frequently they will miss tweets. But what fascinates me, I guess, about Facebook and Twitter almost more than anything else is what their relationship with the real world is. And you'll all recall a couple of years ago, another sip of coffee. Better. You'll be glad to hear it's now daylight in New York. Progress is being made. A couple of years ago, you'll remember that there was a lot of narrative coming out of Twitter and Facebook about the Arab Spring and how it was that people in Cairo and in Benghazi and in Tripoli and other places were able to communicate using Facebook and Twitter in a way they couldn't do before, and that a lot of that communication catalyzed a big change. I did actually ask last April at the US 4A's conference some senior people from Facebook and Twitter how it was they thought the Russians managed to execute the revolution of 1917 without the aid of social media. They didn't answer that question particularly, and the narrative around the Arab Spring has changed a bit in the last sort of 6 months or so, when the great peaceful revolution and overthrow of dictatorships hasn't turned out quite as some people would have liked. But what we do see is that both Facebook and Twitter, and although Twitter kind of controls the narrative about this, that Facebook is an important part of it, is that both of them have become enormous sources of distribution and redistribution of both information and opinion. And it's quite comforting in a way that 8 out of 10 of the most shared on Facebook and most retweeted, obviously on Twitter, sources of information are actually established news organizations. And the BBC, of which I declare my interest because I'm a director of BBC Global News, the BBC is the most retweeted and most shared news source in the whole world, which is kind of encouraging. But also in that list, CNN, the Huffington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian, and others are being massively shared in those environments. And so what Twitter and Facebook have done in many cases is they've actually revolutionized the distribution, particularly of the news industry. And it's certainly true to say that no one has consumed, well, never in history have the journalism of The Guardian and the New York Times and others been consumed in the volumes they are now. And so I think that's a very exciting kind of development for humanity. if you like. So, but this whole area, as I say, of marketing in that very, very active stream is a real challenge for advertisers. And what we've seen is the development of what I refer to as light touch creativity, often simple photographic images with light commentary widely distributed by paid media through those environments in page posts in Facebook, and things like using Twitter cards on Twitter and Vine on Twitter to give people very short but kind of quite compelling and creative experiences in those environments. And I think some advertisers are becoming very good at that. Others aren't, and it's worth looking into the kind of best of Facebook to see what best practice is. And both Unilever, I'm glad to say, clients of ours, and Procter in many markets, clients of ours, and Nestle, and in Nestle's case, particularly with the Purina brand, in Unilever's case with Ben & Jerry's and others, have become pretty expert creative users of Facebook, particular among social platforms. I think in the area of Twitter, the most famous Twitter campaign so far is for Mondelez International and a brand called Oreo, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And they built a campaign, I think around the 150th birthday of Oreo, in which they produced a different image for every day for 150 days that was timely and relevant, but then had a team working very specifically to say, if a real world event takes place that allows us to do a more engaging piece of creative, we'll substitute that. And so the two most famous examples of that were the piece they made for the Mars rover landing, which was an Oreo with red cream with tire tracks on it, an image that many of you will have seen, and also what they did around the blackout when the lights failed in the Super Bowl in the New Orleans Superdome earlier this year. The reason why I tell this story is that it's created a kind of new paradigm for some advertisers, and the concept of owning moments rather than owning target audiences and having brands come to life and light up the social media landscape because they're super relevant at a very specific moment in time has become something that brands have started to pursue. The earliest example of this, I think, was actually something that P&G did with the Tide brand during a NASCAR race. I don't know how many of you are familiar with NASCAR, but they are very, 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 very fast versions of very, very, very ordinary cars. And in order to compete in NASCAR, you have to have one skill, and the skill is to be able to turn left. And because NASCAR is always on a left-hand track and they just go round and round for 500 miles. And there was a fire on the track, and one of the drivers actually took a video on his phone of the car through the window of his car at the exact moment that they were pouring Tide onto the track to clear up the oil spill. And that, in a way, that moment was the birth of this whole idea of newsrooming, as the subject has become known. So it doesn't work for everybody all the time, but if you are, as advertisers, thinking about what are your main events of your business year, what are the main programs you're going to invest in with media partners, what are the main events you're going to invest in with the IPL or whoever it might happen to be, or the World Cup upcoming, then thinking about how you set up a real-time response unit around those kinds of events, I think will become quite normal practice for advertisers around the world, because people have realized that if you can light up social media and other media with really relevant communications, then you've got a chance of still extracting value in that environment. I think I'll pause, and if anyone wants to ask some questions now, I have much more to say, but I'll pause for a moment.
Sure, there are a lot of questions. Thanks, Rob. Very enriching talk that you gave. I'm going to throw it over to people.
I have a question about mobile and what you see in, I mean, it's one thing to talk about Facebook and Twitter as medium, and then whatever you do there tends to have both web, desktop, and mobile use cases. And then the points you made about, well, all the things that if I think of India, a lot of companies are still in the first step of, hey, let's put up a Facebook page and get some likes. Let's set up a tweet channel and see what happens. So the aspect of, I think to your point about best in class on what's happening on digital advertising, it's still very piecemeal, and the few campaigns that go on to win awards is not reflective of the collective activity of brands. So the question is, for India, do we look at the, say, the US or other developed markets and follow that curve, saying that that curve still has freshness and relevance for India? Or do we say, well, let's listen to Rob and say that all that is old hat because it's not going to work. There's no real earned media.
So the short answer to the question is, I am a huge fan of both Twitter and Facebook as advertising media. Huge fan, just to be clear. And the only doubt I was expressing is as to whether the right strategy for Facebook advertising is to invest in buying fans, as opposed to is the right strategy for Facebook to make the right kind of creative and make targeted ad buys on creative and build your effectiveness that way. And I suspect that the second answer is the right one. So I think what you're going to do, you have the advantage of being a follower in this sense of skipping a phase of the engagement that probably turned out not to be of durable value. On Twitter, on the other hand, I think that if you can reach out to real influencers, and I think it depends very much on what kind of business you are in. And I think for those of you that are in technology and business to business and so forth, building substantial follower bases on Twitter is a very good investment of dollars. I think if you're in the packaged goods business, maybe less so, less important to build a population of followers. But I'm certainly not suggesting for any moment that you skip that generation. And I think the other advantage you have is that you can pretty much skip the creative development on both Facebook and Twitter through the prism of the desktop and think specifically about how you create for mobile first in that environment.
Rob, I wanted your comments on how you see this entire space of made for digital content, which one is finding brands now beginning to invest into, in a way an extension of the fact that you've sort of bought those communities on Facebook, etc. And it doesn't matter if it's a 12, 14 million community, but when you do something to post a post over there, you get as little as 782 people further liking it or commenting on it. And perhaps, this entire space where brands are recognizing the need to engage with consumers, leveraging content, and what are some of the trends and what should be some of the companies that are making big bets in this area?
So thank you. That's a very important question, and content marketing has become, content marketing and native advertising have been the kind of buzzwords in the US this year, and it's if I hear one more conference about either, I shall just shoot myself because it'll save time. And content marketing is incredibly difficult. And the reason why it's incredibly difficult is that the consumer has an enormous choice of content to consume. They have all the content that's always existed on television and radio in print, which is pretty good because it's made by professionals. They now have a prodigious amount of user-generated content. And for brands to break through with original content is really, really hard, and quite why a brand has expectations that they can spend $10,000 producing a piece of content that will get massively consumed when other people in Mumbai and everywhere else in India are spending much more money on that, on professional content, and the brands expect to win, I think is, I wouldn't say delusional, but I'd say it was optimistic. And one of the difficulties is that there's always a breakthrough item that occurs every now and again of a piece of content that achieves a very significant organic audience, and then everyone says, aha, I want one of those. But it's very, very, very difficult to do, and to plan virality is hard. So the question becomes, is there a content form other than advertising, either that's much shorter than advertising in a Facebook post or a 6-second video, or much longer than standard advertising in 2.5 or 3-minute video, that you believe has sufficient engagement quality for consumers that you are going to pay to distribute? Because the good news in all of this is that it doesn't cost any more to distribute long-form content now than it does short-form content. Because one of the great things about the internet is that it's broken that tie between space and time, if you like. So if you run an ad on YouTube and promote it, or run a piece of content on YouTube and promote it, it doesn't cost more to promote 5 minutes of content than it does 30 seconds of content. And so I think what advertisers are turning to is saying, how can I do something that is a richer experience and promote that richer experience and make different things? And I think some people are being quite successful with that. But the quality bar remains very high, gentlemen, because the consumer has many, many, many choices. The other, and it's interesting to me that, we always thought about packaged goods and automotive as being the leaders in advertising and content, but actually B2B businesses are becoming the leaders in content. And when I think about companies like IBM and what they do on Tumblr and on Twitter, and I think about GE in the same kind of environments, what I see is some very, very, very interesting uses of short-form video, long-form video, infographics, extended information, published thought pieces, and so forth, that are a very relevant narrative to those people's audiences. And when you subject this thought to analysis, then it sort of, you kind of say, well, of course that works. And the reason why you say, of course that works, is that if you're GE and your end game is to sell someone a jet engine, for example, now jet engines, relatively speaking, when compared to shampoo, are quite a considered purchase. The last time I looked, people tend not to, it's not like we have a Friday one-day sale of jet engines, let's go. And
maybe
so,
at the Dubai Air Show.
The Dubai Air Show, exactly, right, that's right. Buy now. If you arrive before 8 in the morning, you get 10% off. And so I think actually the B2B advertisers, and I would include Cisco in that and others, are doing a really great job of content marketing. And I think that if you're a brand, you have to think about what it is that adds value to the consumer experience and what kind of changes the narrative beyond product performance if you're going to start making original content. It's a very, very thoughtful process.
Sure. No, I was alluding to the aspect of, I completely agree with you with regard to this is not about them recreating what already exists. It could well be about brands wanting to leverage that content which consumers are finding affinity towards, to be able to use it to both curate, sustain, and grow those communities. At one level, the kind of thing that, let's say, Vice and the Creators Project did with Intel, which turned out to be reasonably successful, and I'm sure you're very familiar with Shane and the team of at Vice, etc.
Oh, yeah.
At the other level, sort of programs like the Old Spice Man and elements like that. And I understand in each of these there will be those one-off, very successful kind of things, but are you finding that brands are looking at what they can do with content a little more closely than perhaps they were doing 2 years ago?
Oh, so the answer is of course, but let me just address something you said. So I think the Spice campaign, which is kind of genius. So P&G is, I think, and Old Spice is almost the only brand in the YouTube top 20 in which most of the assets on the channel actually started life as advertising or became variations of them. And I think what that is simple creative genius, which has always been a very good thing. I think the Creators Project is something very different. I think the Creators Project is so for those of you that don't know, the Creators Project is a project by a US-based, very kind of cool publishing business that is all around the intersection of creativity and technology, whether that technology is applied in music, in fashion, in art, in design, and so forth. And it's an extremely rich platform, and Intel is the sponsor of the platform, and Intel pays Vice a very significant amount of money every year to run the Creators Project. And what it does for Intel is that it puts Intel into the center of those creative technology communities and actually gets them access to some of the greatest innovators and young innovators who they may not have surfaced otherwise. So the two projects are very different. And to be clear, the Creators Project is a multi-million-dollar per year investment. So Mustafa and Old Spice and Creators couldn't be more different from one another. They are the very polarity of this kind of marketing. And I don't really consider Mustafa to be a kind of content project. I think it's a low-cost, high-production, beautifully done advertising project. So I think that you are right. Advertisers are paying more attention to this kind of content, and I think we'll see more and more of it. And then what they will seek to do, the mindset will be, instead of making ads and buying time to distribute those ads, what they will be thinking of doing is producing content and syndicating that content to communities and across relevant media outlets. So I think people have a kind of different mindset about the way they think about it, and they'll be thinking more about syndication of content, but they'll still have to use advertising as we understand it in order to make people aware of the content they're syndicating, because as my esteemed colleague Jeremy Bullmore once famously said, if you want to be as famous as Madonna, everybody has to know who you are.
Rob, thanks for the great insights. Being in the social media space, I totally agree with you what you said on Facebook and Twitter, and we live those problems every day as well. What I wanted to ask you is that, I mean, you've mentioned two buzzwords this year, like content marketing and native advertising.
Sure.
On the tech space, we hear buzzwords like big data analytics and mobile and VAS and more stuff like that. But what do you feel is the hidden treasure which no one is looking at, which might become the buzzword in 2014 or beyond?
Oh, goodness. So I think I'd be much richer than I am if I really knew the answer to that. So, I mean, let's talk about big data just for a moment. So the big data is kind of interesting, but it's not an end in itself. There's a, as someone famously said, and I actually requoted the other day, the truth is that in the world, dogs bite men more often than men bite dogs. And I think the trick with big data is to find that piece in the data that tells you when the man is biting the dog, and developing that man bites dog into an insight that opens up a new seam of audience or revenue for you. I think that there's going to be a very emerging, interesting advertising player in 2014. I think a lot of, actually even consumer brands as well as corporate brands, will be paying a lot of attention to LinkedIn. in 2014 and their content strategy and the new form of segmentation that LinkedIn allows. And Jeff Weiner, the CEO, very elegantly describes it and says one way of describing all the economic value in the world is to look at all the companies in the world and all the people that work in all the companies in the world. And if you can connect those two things, you have economic value. And I think LinkedIn is going to be very important. And I actually think LinkedIn as a publishing platform for companies, and I think for all of your companies, if you haven't built an Indian LinkedIn profile and company page for your brand, you absolutely should. And I think whether you're in the packaged goods business or automotive, that's an important thing to do. And we're seeing very significant sharing numbers off LinkedIn because it's a very kind of committed and motivated community because of people's need to advance themselves. I think the other thing, if I'm thinking specifically about India and the disparate nature and distribution of technology in India, I'd be thinking very much about who the technology-enabled people are, as well as the technology-enabled regions are, and think about how you can apply technology specifically to community leaders, whether they're in villages, whether they dictate people's shopping habits or healthcare habits, and use those people as the amplifier of a message and treat them as a sophisticated internet audience, but also treat their ability to spread by real word of mouth rather than necessarily by social networks. And I think India, among all the countries in the world, and Africa, of course, to come in the next decade, is going to be characterized a lot by local influencers who have access to technology, influencing people who perhaps don't have access to technology yet. And I think that's a relatively undiscussed part of marketing, although, I mean, in the technology point of view, although, of course, Lever with their strategy, and others with their strategy of producing extremely small pack sizes in certain markets of detergent and moving those pack sizes through to leaders in villages for distribution, it's the same model, but apply it to technology. And I think that could be very important, using technology, if you like, as a relay station into smaller communities, particularly in a country where organized retail still represents a relatively small portion of all retail and e-commerce, an even smaller proportion of that. So I don't have a buzzword for 2014, but I have some thoughts about how the impact of technology can go wider than the physical spread of the actual technology, if that makes sense.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
There's a question here. We had the Google Hangout platform doesn't allow more than 10 people at a time. So there's Akhil Almeida who asked this question. He asked 3 questions. I'm going to ask you one only. Okay. Companies are investing time and resources in building online communities, but statistics show that growth in social media platforms like Facebook are declining, especially among users. What's your take on this, and what can brands do to protect their investment?
Well, that kind of goes back to where we were before. I think the decline in teenage adoption of Facebook has been somewhat overstated, and Sheryl Sandberg vigorously defended their numbers on that front. And actually, Facebook's turned into a bit of a surprise, as it's turned into a very sophisticated communication mechanism which maintains connections with people who aren't in the same place. And it's always kind of interesting to me that advertisers in the US have focused their advertising investment on people aged between 18 and 49, and suddenly they're spooked by the idea that 13-year-olds don't use Facebook, which is somewhat counterintuitive in some ways. But I think this goes back to the issue about investing in communities. And I think there's 2 ways that you can think about that. If you think about it, the idea of having a community around Manchester United is really kind of easy. And if you're Airtel, I think Airtel's Facebook page is dominated by their sponsorship of Manchester United, and the reason I suspect that people spend time on Airtel's Facebook page is because they're more interested in Manchester United than maybe they are in Airtel, which is fair. But what we have to recognize is that in social media, we've got some fantastically granular targeting opportunities. So we can say, well, if we think our brand appeals to people that like cricket and Madonna, I don't know if there is anyone that likes cricket and Madonna, but let's just imagine there is. And it's about cricket and Madonna, and it's people in Chennai, Kochi, and Hyderabad, then Facebook, for example, allows you to reach an audience at that level of granularity that's been extraordinarily difficult to do before, to combine age, interests, social behaviors, and geography is a truly wonderful thing for advertisers. So my answer to your questioner is think about these things in terms of their targeting potential. Think about the creative you're going to use in terms of the behaviors of those people you're trying to target, because there's no point being able to target on a granular basis if you just think you're going to produce the same creative for everyone. So I would think more about social networks in that sense than it's about the people being social with each other necessarily than about the people being social with brands.
I just wanted to know how important is video as a medium of communication.
The question was, he wanted you to comment on the surge of video.
Sure. Yeah. So I think that, you know, it's no surprise that people like consuming video more than anything else, because we sort of discovered that with television, really, that people like video. And I must say that, you know, obviously the development of the smartphone market in India, whilst it's not in volume terms at the same level as the US or China, the growth in relatively low-cost Android devices that are video capable is phenomenal in India. And I think that there's a very realistic policy by the carriers on the pricing strategy, both in terms of mobile broadband plans, the simplicity of top-up on prepaid plans, and also the pricing of individual video items. I think the carriers have been very economically rational in the way they've thought about this, and I think what that will do is it will bring far more user-generated video to India. I think it creates terrific distribution opportunities for brand video in mobile environments. And I think that relatively unusually, because the carriers aren't a big content influencer in many parts of the world, they've become the owners of pipes, if you like, more than the owners of content. And that's particularly in those markets where iPhone dominates and the carriers have no ability to customize the deck, which of course they do in India with an Android-dominated market. I think actually the alliances between advertisers and carriers, whether it's Vodafone or Airtel or whoever, as potential distribution of sort of video content is really valuable. And I suspect that as a proportion of advertising and marketing that's done on video to mobile devices as a percentage of all advertising, India could end up leading the world in that area. So I'm super optimistic about it. I mean, it's something that people couldn't have imagined. You know, we're now looking, I mean, when you're on the New York subway in the morning, the number of people watching full-length TV shows that they've downloaded on their mobile devices on the subway is quite remarkable, and it's almost become a new day part for advertisers. But I think as long as the price-value equation on the availability of bandwidth and the quality of the handsets remains roughly where it is now or gets cheaper, I think video's got a fantastically strong future on mobile in India.
Thank you, Rob. We've had a fairly enriching set of questions, your interesting discussion here. And many more questions to come in, but I don't think we have too much time. Rob, it's a holiday today, so have a good weekend and happy Thanksgiving. I'm going to hand it over to Neeraj. Are you there?
Yeah, thanks, Pradyuman, and thank you very much, Rob, and echo the same sentiment. Happy Thanksgiving to you, your family, and thank you for taking the time out to be with us. We look forward to seeing you in Jaipur during stream and certainly continuing this conversation with you. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend ahead.
Thank you, everyone, and all of my colleagues know that my favorite place to visit in the world is India, so I'll see you soon. See you in the middle of February. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye. Take care.